One, and we're live.
Wonderful. Well, it's always a tantalizing moment when we're waiting for it to actually go through on YouTube, but I'm sure we're live by this point. Hello, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Robert Baines. I'm the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada. We're a charitable NGO dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians just don't have to think about security or haven't until the past few months, and that's been great, but it has caused us problems. It has caused us the challenge of taking things for granted. And security is not something that we can take for granted. It's woven into everything we do. Every time we just have a coffee with a friend, have dinner with our family, if we're going out to a movie, all of those experiences, all of those things that mean the most to us in our lives, those things are underwritten by an invisible piece of infrastructure called security. And that's what NATO is all about. NATO is Canada's premier entity, international organization for maintaining our security and our way of life. It is based on our interests and our values. It's based on a very simple premise that an attack upon one is an attack upon all, which just means that we will look out for our friends and they will look out for us. This very important insight was gathered from all of the death and destruction of the Second World War. This is what we learned, that you have to maintain peace through strength. It's just like if you were in a bar and somebody starts to pick a fight with you, the best way to stop that fight, bar none, is by saying you're with the hockey team. It's something anybody can understand. You will stop that fight. And if somebody's still intent on fighting, you can handle it because you're with a hockey team. That's the whole idea. It's all based on trust and friendship. And that is what NATO means to Canada. And that's why Canada has to stand up strong to maintain our security as a part of NATO and as a strong ally. Today, of course, we're going to talk about disinformation, and it's really key for our whole community to be keyed in to these discussions. Disinformation is the easiest way for NATO to be prized apart from one another. Division. It is such an important aspect that we have to discuss and be aware of at all times. Really, we're all about community. And if you aren't a member of the NATO Association yet, please do become a member. Follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. Obviously, please do subscribe to us here on YouTube. Stay part of the conversation. Talk to your friends and your family, those friends that you've got at work. It's really important that we keep this conversation going, and I hope you'll enjoy it today. Allow me to introduce our three moderators who will then introduce our speakers and get the conversation going. Thrilled to have Anastasia, James, and Muskan take us through this conversation. Three of them are outstanding members of our team at the NATO Association, and I'm very proud to work with them day in and day out. Please take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. It is again, my name is James Lunds, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mr. Marcus Kolga and Dr. Heidi Tworek, who are our expert panelists for today. Marcus Kolga is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, human rights activist, and Canadian analyst of foreign disinformation and influence operations. He frequently writes and comments on Russia and Central and Eastern European issues, and disinformation in Canadian and international media. A regular commentator on international affairs and human rights, Mr. Kolga's articles have been published by the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the National Post, the New York Daily Mail, Maclean's, the Atlantic Council, the European Observer, and other European publications. He has worked extensively with pro-Russian democracy groups. We are very pleased to have him here today speaking with us. I would also like to introduce Dr. Heidi Tworek, who is a Canadian research chair and professor of international history and public policy at the University of British Columbia. She directs the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Her work examines history and policy around communications, particularly the effects of new media technologies on democracy. She is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, as well as a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Dr. Tworek's interest in democracy was spurred by writing her prize-winning book, News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications, 1900 to 1945. with all that said, I would like to pass the baton over to my fellow moderator, Muskan, to start us off with the first question.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you, Mr. Kolga and Professor Tworek, for joining this important discussion. Without further ado, the first question we have is, what does disinformation mean to you? I will begin with Mr. Kolga and then pass it to Professor Tworek.
Well, thank you, Muskan. Thank you, James. Thank you, Robert, for all the work that you're doing at the NATO Association. It's so critical right now with this intensifying information war that is happening, much of it targeting NATO, unity within NATO. The work that you're doing today is so much more important than it has ever been before. So thank you for that, and keep up the great work. So what does disinformation mean to me? Well, it means a lot of things to me personally, aside from the formal definition of it. As a Canadian of Estonian heritage, my entire community, our families, have all been historically impacted by disinformation, because disinformation is a key weapon of almost all authoritarian and totalitarian regimes around the world. They would not be able to exist without this very effective weapon to manipulate, control, and repress their own people. My grandparents were forced to flee Estonia in 1944 because they knew the Soviet Russians would brutally repress their families, friends, and communities, robbing them of their freedom and democracy, and that they'd use disinformation to control them. Even in the safety of Canada, my community, along with anyone else who stood against Russia's Soviet-era colonization, were targeted with Cold War disinformation. The same kind of narratives that Russia uses today to target Ukraine. They were used to discredit and dehumanize Canadians of Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian heritage. And they also tried to incite hate towards these communities, just as they do today. And my community isn't alone by any means. Iran and China are equally active in using disinformation to dehumanize minority communities in Canada. This includes the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong activists, Falun Gong. And I'd also say, Cubans and Venezuelans. Those are also communities that might be threatened by disinformation. So growing up, even in my childhood, I had constant reminders of what disinformation looked like. It was all around. I was aware of the impact it had on the freedom of nations held captive by Russia, and how it contributed to the loss of freedom and democracy in those nations. And it's really, one of the reasons why my family is in Canada today at all. But disinformation also continues to have a direct impact on my personal life and my family. I'm a regular target of Russian state and state-aligned media. I've been targeted with harassment, intimidation, multiple death threats, and this happens on a pretty regular basis. In 2017, a member of the Russian Duma tabled a motion in Russia's parliament demanding that the Russian Investigative Committee, Russia's version of the RCMP, basically, this Duma member asked that they investigate me for anti-Russian activities based on an event that the NATO Association of Canada actually sponsored in Toronto, and that I organized, commemorating the assassination of my late friend Boris Nemtsov in 2015. In 2019, the threats became so aggressive and vicious that my local law enforcement unit opened an investigation and found one of the perpetrators, a radicalized Russian nationalist living between North York and Florida. And then a year later, Russia's most read tabloid, Komsomolskaya Pravda, published multiple articles containing disinformation directed at me, culminating in a change.org petition demanding that the Canadian government strip me of my identity. And it's not just Moscow. Local Kremlin-aligned influencers and proxies, both on the far left and far right, have published columns in our national papers attacking me. One former Star RT columnist, who was inexplicably called to testify before Madam Hogue last year, even used half of his time at the commission to try and discredit me. And the result of these disinformation attacks targeting me is that I've had to place multiple cameras around my house. I attend regular briefings about my safety and my family's safety. I have to be careful about where I travel because both China and Russia have placed me on their sanctions list. And the psychological toll is also sometimes quite difficult. It's also mentally and physically taxing. So I can give you the formal definition of disinformation and what that means to me, but I thought that my more sort of existential real world answer might be more interesting, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that response. I will pass it to Professor Tworek for her comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Muskan, James, and Anastasia, and to Robert for organizing this event. And thank you so much to Marcus for giving us, I think, a really crucial sense of the human toll of what we're talking about. So you didn't want to do formal definitions, so I'll do the formal definitions for you. So generally, when scholars and others talk about disinformation, we're talking about falsified information is deliberately spread. So dis and deliberate. There's of course also the term misinformation, which generally refers to something that's mistakenly spread in some way. So it might be false or misleading, but might be mistakenly spread. There's also the idea of malinformation, and there are of course all sorts of other synonyms that have floated around at different times for different purposes, whether it's fake news or propaganda. During COVID-19, the Director General of the WHO often talked about an infodemic. So or some other people will talk about information warfare. So each of these have slightly different nuances. They emerge at different times historically for different reasons. But I think maybe a couple of things to point out are just that one of the reasons that I think disinformation keeps coming back as a term, even though it's contested, is that it helps us think about intent. As hard as that is to unpack, it helps us to try and understand the networks behind the piece of information. So I'm always really interested in not just the content of what is coming out, but what are the networks that enable it to happen, and why are certain states, individuals, corporations trying to spread it? And the term disinformation helps to point us a little bit at those broader networks. But I will say that within the scholarship, it remains a term that's quite disputed as to whether it's really that useful, as to how far it actually gets us, in part because it requires understanding intent, which can be hard to get at, in part because sometimes what malign actors are doing is spreading things that are truthful, but they're spreading selective truths. So disinformation doesn't get to those kind of dynamics, and in part because just focusing on disinformation might take us away from all of the other kind of dynamics within the information space. So I throw a few scholarly things out there to complement what Marcus was saying.
Thank you for your answers, and thank you to the both of you for being here today. My name is Anastasia, and I'm also an engagement coordinator at the NAOC. And the first question for me is, Commissioner Marie-Josée Hogue, in her final report on foreign interference, mentioned that the greatest threat to democracy is disinformation. That said, how does disinformation threaten democracies in the West? And once again, I will first pass it to Mr. Kolga and then to Professor Tworek.
Well, thank you, Anastasia, for that very good question. Look, I personally very much agree with Commissioner Hogue's conclusion that disinformation is indeed an existential threat to our democracy. It through the polarization that it creates, it threatens the cohesion of our society by breaking down, trying to break down trust, our public trust in our democratic institutions, our elected officials, our government, media, civil society, academia, and eventually in each other. And we've been seeing this, an intensification of this, certainly since COVID, and even more intensely since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we certainly have evidence of this. Where I sort of disagreed with Madame Hogue's conclusion is on Russian disinformation. Unfortunately, in her final report, she suggested that while Russia has the means and resources to engage in widespread disinformation information and influence operations targeting Canada, that she didn't seem to find that Russia had the intent to do so. But we've seen Russia do this, quite a lot of this since certainly since 2015, but even for the past 80 years. I mean, the first case that we saw of disinformation targeting Canada by Moscow was back in the 1930s and 1940s, and we know this because a Russian GRU cipher clerk who was operating in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, a man named Igor Guzenko, decided one evening in 1945 that he wanted to defect to Canada with his family, recognizing that he may have a better life in Canada, and took with him a trove of documents, stuffed them under his shirt, and walked out of the embassy. In those documents, those top secret documents, were the names of nearly 24 Canadians who were working with the Russian government, or the Soviet government then, as assets. And their primary role, according to Guzenko, was to influence our information spaces and to influence Canadian government policy making. And so they've been at it. We know that they've been at it for quite some time. We know in 2015, in fact, during those elections, the Russian government, just after the Russian occupation of Crimea, that Russia set up a grassroots organization within the Russian diaspora, which was set up to try and influence the way that the Russian diaspora would vote in those elections. Stephen Harper then was targeted, Chris Alexander, the Minister of Immigration at the time, and James Bazan, who was working, I think he was the Minister of Defense at the time, was targeted. And we've seen this over and over again. In 2018, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrysler Freeland, was targeted with a campaign that's, I think, familiar to most Canadians now, this Russian disinformation campaign that basically targets all Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government of being neo-Nazis. Ms. Freeland was targeted with this same narrative, and it's been ongoing since the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We've seen the Ukrainian diaspora targeted with that same narrative and efforts to incite hate towards them and to dehumanize the Ukrainian community. So we are constantly getting bombarded and targeted with certainly with Russian disinformation, also China and others. And we need to recognize and acknowledge the full scope of that if we do want to build resilience against disinformation in the long run, and their efforts to undermine our democracy and, like I said, tear apart the cohesion of our society.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I definitely see there are so many ways in which disinformation affects our democracy, and yeah, it's seen in all the examples you mentioned. I will now pass it on to Professor Tworek for her comments.
Yeah, thank you. So, and Marcus and I actually had the privilege of being on the same panel, testifying before the public inquiry. So it's nice to be back on a panel a panel together again. I guess I would say certainly it's a threat, but my slight concern with saying it is the greatest and most existential threat is perhaps twofold. One is that sometimes this may portray it as something unprecedented, which as a historian we know it's not. Provision of information has always been intertwined with efforts to manipulate that. There are ways in which what is happening now is different, but I think that casts a slightly different spin on it. And the second is that I worry if we focus on just the foreign disinformation, that we pull the focus away from how to strengthen one's domestic information system. And maybe the third thing is that we don't want to focus on information to pull away from addressing Canadians' real concerns, right? And we're obviously in the middle of an election. There's lots of talk about all the things around affordability, housing, et cetera, et cetera. So these are real, deep, and experienced problems that people have. And so my one caution of placing this as the most existential threat is we don't want that to pull away from how we address the real problems that people are feeling in their lives, which may make them more discontented and therefore more open or receptive to different kinds of disinformation, that these are other ways that trust in government are decreased. So all of that is to say that the information environment, the information ecosystem is deeply important. But one piece of disinformation we know from research isn't going to radically change what somebody believes about the world. In general, it will do different things, right? It might reinforce beliefs they already have. Over time, it may draw them into a different understanding of the world. But I think when we're trying to assess the kind of threat that disinformation is, we need to have that little bit of extra nuance, just so we don't fall into the trap of thinking people see one piece of disinformation and suddenly their entire worldview has changed. No, it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? There's a lot more going on. And so if we start to tease that out, we start to pull ourselves into a bit of a different situation, are slightly different questions. And I think we'll get to how you create more of a resilient information ecosystem. But that to me is just a huge part of the puzzle that is about what we do domestically and not just how we react to external threats.
An excellent response. And I would like to ask you, Dr. Tworek, how you talk about the nuances in this and the nuances of all these problems and how disinformation infects the information system. But there was something that Mr. Kolga remarked upon earlier regarding polarization. And so I want to ask you, how does disinformation heighten polarization in societies, and does that pull us away from deliberative democracy? How does that affect decision making within it?
Yeah, again, it's a very complex question, because there's also, a huge amount of scholarship on polarization, also questioning in some cases whether it is the most important thing that we need to be concerned about. And I think, for example, we've seen in Canada over the last 2 months astonishing changes in polling, right? In terms of what people are saying are the things they care most about, the party they're going to support in an election. So part of this is to say that a lot of the assumptions about polarization are often based on research that looks at the United States. And the United States is exceptionally sticky in terms of people's political identities. So in 2024, 91% voted exactly the same as they did in 2020. Only 9% of people changed their minds. That's going to look dramatically different in Canada. It looks very different in the UK. So it's just a caution that often when we talk about polarization, we have this vision that's somehow based on the US, but the US is actually very, very exceptional. So having said that, how does disinformation play into some types of polarization within society? Well, what it does is things more in the long term, like what I'd mentioned before, is that it can potentially entrench people into a certain type of worldview. It can reinforce beliefs that they already have. It may be that they're looking at a very particular set of information sources and not having as broad a media diet, so they're not necessarily being exposed to as many different types of information. And what we find with some studies is that even when we do fact check something, people may change their minds about a particular fact, but they won't necessarily change their overall belief system. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind. And what final thing that I'll say is that studies that have been done that are looking more cross-nationally do find that the places that have robust public media systems tend to have less problems with polarization.
Fascinating. If I may ask Mr. Kolga, any comments, any insights regarding the matter of polarization and how it possibly leads us away from deliberative democracy? Any comment upon the statistic and fact that Professor Tworek brought up of public media acting as a bulwark?
Well, I will sort of continue a little bit on about how our foreign adversaries actually exploit those natural biases that we do have and the divisions that have sort of grown over the past, I think, within society over the past decade or so. We know how Russia exploits them thanks to an FBI affidavit that was released in September of last year. The focus of that affidavit was on the Russian doppelganger campaign. This is a campaign where Russian social media companies or communications companies were instructed by the Kremlin to basically create fake news sites, hundreds of them, using known URLs of major Western news companies. So you would have, for example, theglobeandmail.com, which is the actual site for the Globe and Mail. They would then buy up the URL globeandmail.news or globeandmail.mobile or something like that. But they did these with all sorts of major news media outlets and basically created fake versions of them. Posted news on them using various different techniques, and used bots to try and amplify those fake news sites, which had contained all sorts of misleading information. But the interesting thing in that affidavit were the minutes of meetings between those companies and senior officials in the Russian presidential administration, and sort of the instructions that were included in those minutes. And what was striking to me was that these companies were instructed to monitor Western information spaces, to identify potential conflicts between different nations, but also to identify the most potentially polarizing and divisive issues within various different nations. The instructions then were for these companies to use various different social media techniques, to use an army of thousands of influencers, a network that the Kremlin has been creating and developing over the past number of years, basically to target those specific issues and both sides of them, and to pull on them, to basically pour fuel onto both sides of these polarizing issues in order to further divide Western societies. And the most interesting thing that was included in those documents was the instruction that these companies, if they couldn't find any sort of conflicts or any really polarizing issues, they were instructed to use fake news, disinformation, even deep fakes to create that conflict within Western nations and amongst Western nations as well. So Russia is extremely active in exploiting, again, the existing biases that we have to try and push the boundaries on them, to try and divide us further. And this is happening, as Professor Tworek mentioned, it's happening in the United States, but it's happening right here in Canada. We know that Canada is being targeted by these operations, again, thanks to this FBI affidavit, and also, of course, the tenant media situation that was exposed around the same time as this FBI affidavit was released.
Thank you so much, both, for your thoughtful remarks. Building on how disinformation heightens polarization among society, specifically in the Canadian context, I know Professor Tworek brought this up. How do algorithms contribute to the amplification of false narratives, and should they be more regulated, specifically domestically? In other words, how do we balance our freedom of speech here in Canada, but at the same time also protect our democratic institution against Mr. Kolga, you mentioned about these foreign advisories that are coming in and playing a role in, to some extent, threatening the democracy of Canada. I'll begin with Mr. Kolga and then pass it to Professor Tworek.
Well, look, I mean, if we're looking at these social media companies, their businesses, their primary interest is in ensuring that they maximize their profits. They don't have an interest in the safety of the people that use them, the information that's being spread on those websites, and we've witnessed over the past how long has President Trump been in office now? 2 months. We've seen a retreat by these social media companies in terms of moderating the content that is being posted on their websites. And Twitter was doing, from personal experience, working with their safety teams, was doing a very good job before Elon Musk purchased that platform. As soon as he purchased that platform, he began removing the individuals who were tasked with ensuring that the platform was being moderated, that the information that was being spread was being posted on there was being done safely. That those teams were completely removed from that platform, and so. Mr. Musk has made it very clear that profits are his primary objective on that platform, and and to, in his view, to ensure that there's a complete free expression on there. That means whether it's truth, facts, or disinformation, false news, all of that seems to be fair game on Twitter or X at the moment. And so I don't think there's much hope, at least for the Canadian government and for Canadians. There's not much hope that Twitter will be cleaning up its act all that soon. Facebook, of course, as well, has declared about a month and a half ago that it would be removing its content moderation teams from its platform. And so, it's really become the Wild West on these major social media platforms. I don't think that Canada, even if we necessarily wanted to independently try to regulate them, I don't think that we'd have too much success. These are large companies, primarily based in the United States. I'm not sure that they would necessarily comply with any regulations that we would put in place. Where we have seen some success in this is in Europe with the Digital Services Act. Europe obviously is much larger than Canada. And it does appear that they have, through those regulations, forced most of these large social media companies to comply when disinformation is identified on those platforms. That the Digital Services Act requires those social media companies to remove those pieces of content, and they seem to be complying. I suggest that Canada perhaps should be talking to our European allies and harmonizing, if we do want to try and regulate some of these platforms, work with the Europeans, join them somehow through treaty or otherwise, and use the existing legislation that they have, the regulations that they have, to try and clean up our information space. I think that's probably the way to go. I don't think there's any hope of working with the United States, or at least the Trump administration right now. They don't seem to have any interest in cleaning up the U.S. information space. So I think working with the Europeans is the way to go.
Thank you for your answers. And yeah, I definitely agree. That's what it looks like right now, that we need to work with Europe more than the US. But building on the points both of you have already made before about the tactics employed by the Kremlin and China, exploiting and dividing us further with disinformation, in what ways are disinformation tactics employed by foreign actors, and how do non-state actors play a role? I will pass it on to Professor Tworek first for this question.
Yeah, so I think we see a whole range of different tactics. And maybe I'll back up for a second and just say that historically, this kind of attempt to use information as a tool of state power that you project outwards has been a feature, not a bug, of the international system. So there are periods where this isn't as prominent, say the 1990s. But if we look back historically, this happens quite frequently, right? My book is about how and why Germans in the first half of the 20th century turned to do this. We have the Soviet Union, China getting interested from the late 1970s. And how do you use information to project power outwards? It doesn't mean that that's always disinformation, but there's a long history of these kinds of tactics in different kinds of ways, right? Information competition is a huge part of the Cold War, for example. So there's a big range of tactics that can be used. Some of them are content generation. We've talked about websites already, but other things are also financial, right? So the Tenet Media case is an example of you pay someone who you don't tell them what to produce, but they produce stuff that's conducive to your aims. So funding and financial flows can be another really crucial way in which this happens. It's not always dictating what the content is. It's finding ways to support people who may be fulfilling your aims in various kinds of ways. And there's also all sorts of other things, right? Like you can use your own TV or media channels that you then choose to put out in English, let's say, instead of other languages, is another way of projecting quote unquote alternatives. So that there's a whole host of different tactics that get used. And the final thing that I'll throw into the conversation, because we haven't mentioned it yet, is that generative AI has just really lowered the barrier to entry to all these kinds of things. So not only can you throw up a website pretty quickly, but now instead of needing 200 people in a troll farm, one person can make that amount of stuff in an afternoon. And we've seen examples of that. And they can also do that to tailor it very quickly to local contexts as well. So I think that is something that is not a complete game changer, but it does really lower the barrier to entry. And so it'll be, I think, quite important to see as we go forward whether it's going to expand the number of potential state actors who are getting involved in this and just simply flooding the zone with a huge amount of stuff. So this is just absolutely pervasive. And the final thing I'll say about that is in the work that we've done on Gen AI, one of the things we're particularly worried about is the use of deep fakes for harassment of political candidates. So we're thinking about obviously an election right now in Canada. That's something I think we need to be really on the alert for, and we've seen that be used primarily against female candidates as well. And then I'll hand over to Marcus. I saw you unmuting enthusiastically about to say something.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on your points about AI and how these foreign authoritarian regimes that do engage in mass disinformation campaigns, how they're benefiting from that. And one of the ways that we're seeing them clearly exploit this technology is by mass producing content, whether it's Russia Today or Sputnik. You can see that there has been a real proliferation of the number of languages that these services, these are Russian state media services and platforms, the number of languages that they're being offered in. I had a meeting with the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs just about a year and a half ago. And I was personally surprised to see that Sputnik had a Japanese language version. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs themselves had no idea that Russia was serving up state media in the Japanese language, and it goes much further than that. The volume of content that they're now producing, even in French and Spanish, is massive, to be quite frank. We know that in Mexico, for example, the number one most watched foreign news network is RT, and that is not necessarily due to AI, but AI helps with the translation of content from whether it's Russian or English into those other languages. So, targeting foreign nations with a language or content that's in that native language has been exploited by the Russian, certainly by the Russian government. We're seeing China do that as well. And I just wanted to mention, we were talking about Tenet earlier. We know that Russia basically used through RT $10 million to produce this new media platform, Tenet Media. It was, of course, based in the United States, and as Dr. Tworek mentioned earlier, that they identified some of the most influential far-right personalities from YouTube and such. They employed these individuals, paying them as much as $100,000 per podcast episode, basically to do what they regularly do, which is to produce rather polarizing content. But a lot of that, in fact, the entire operation was directed by two employees of RT, and it's true that most of the time these influencers were allowed to do what they regularly do, but Russian narratives were still injected and forced upon many of these influencers, certainly when it came to issues surrounding Ukraine. So, the fact that $10 million was deployed to do this, and not just to target US audiences, but Canadian audiences as well, demonstrates how determined Russia is to influence our information spaces, and again, to contribute to the polarization of important discussions within it.
Excellent. That is actually a perfect segue, Mr. Kolga, into our next question, which is how has disinformation evolved as a tool for geopolitical influence, and what specific threats does it pose to national security today? You talk about these podcasters, these influencers being co-opted by foreign governments to spread disinformation. I was curious if you could maybe speak a little more onto that, and then we'll transition to Dr. Tworek to get the more historical point of view of it.
Certainly. I mean, we are seeing, even right now during the current election, we're seeing foreign governments targeting this election. Just about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, we detected a campaign on Russian state media, on Sputnik, targeting Prime Minister Carney just after his election as liberal leader. There were several points that were brought up in this feature Sputnik article. One of them, rather remarkably, recycled the Ukrainian neo-Nazi label, targeting Mr. Carney with this for his support of Ukraine. Other typical far-right labels were applied to him, targeting his being a former the governor of the Bank of Canada, of the Bank of England, suggesting that he was a member of the elite. So we're seeing Russia get very much involved or try to target this current election. We saw China targeting former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland during the Liberal leadership campaign. And so we are seeing this happen, and we're also seeing Dr. Tworek mentioned generative AI being used to create deepfakes. We detected just about a week and a half ago a campaign targeting Mark Carney as well, basically creating fake images of Mr. Carney sitting on a beach with Jeffrey Epstein and other celebrities, suggesting that there was some sort of a relationship between Mark Carney and Jeffrey Epstein. And so these images were initially created, and we can see that they have been now recycled as part of a broader disinformation campaign, using that same sort of narrative to suggest that Prime Minister Carney and Jeffrey Epstein were somehow involved in inappropriate behavior towards young women, for example. And these videos are now appearing on Twitter. Now, there's no way we're not attributing them to Russia or any foreign actor, but it would surprise me if these foreign authoritarian regimes weren't getting involved in this in terms of applying some of their technologies, using bots to amplify some of those narratives, because we are seeing a spread of them. So these foreign authoritarian regimes are very much interested right now in trying to disrupt and interfere with the current election that's going on.
Excellent. Dr. Tworek, what's the history? What's the historical kind of timeline of this? You've mentioned this has occurred throughout history. What lessons did they learn from there, and how has it evolved from that point?
Yeah, so all the way back in 1620, Ben Jonson, who's a satirist that at least English people know, but maybe not others, but he was certainly, second to Shakespeare in his day. He writes something called a masque, an MASQUE, called News from the New World is Discovered in the Moon. And he is basically making fun of people for being incredibly gullible and believing there are people who live in the moon. And one of the characters in this masque is a printer. And the printer says, basically, I'll take anything, whether it's false or true. I just want anything that's news, right? So this insatiable human desire for news, whether it's false or true, you think of April Fool's jokes, but things that kind of align with our values, the problems of printers or social media platforms being businesses, it's 400 years old, right? So a lot of the problems we are talking about are, I would say, kind of intractable to the media system. But what we see over the course of that 400-year period is a waxing and waning, right? We see states gain greater capabilities to be able to put information into foreign spaces undetected, but that's happening all the way back in 1622. They're just using humans and letters to do so, right? So this is not to say that there's nothing new under the sun, but that I think it's really important for us to take a deep breath, recognize there's no silver bullet, recognize this will not go away, and then we got to act on those principles and say, okay, what are our democratic values here? And then what do we want to look out for? So for me, that often means stepping away from any real ideas of what do we do about the individual piece of content and asking a bit of the deeper questions. So the financial flows is a big one, right? If we look at those financial flows, what are the things that are happening that are simply not legal, right? Canadian individuals have the right to express, within the boundaries of the Charter, to express their opinions as they desire. But what they don't necessarily have the right to do is to be paid by a foreign adversary to do so, right? Particularly in the context of, say, an election, so financial flows. The second is the question of what kind of behaviors we might see on platforms, right? So things that Facebook used to call coordinated inauthentic behavior. The third thing is the question of the kinds of advertisements that are allowed, right? Back in 2016, one of the things that was happening was Russia paying for ads on Facebook, including in rubles, and this simply not being detected, right? We see difficulties with ads continue on social media platforms, problems with enforcement. So these are just a few of the things that I think we can think about before, again, we go back to how do we strengthen our domestic resilience, part of which is understanding that this is part of what it means to be a democracy, right? Part of what it means to be a democracy is to contend with information coming from a whole host of different places. And maybe the final thing that I'll say is what's also crucial, I think, at this moment is to understand the scale and the spread of this, and that sometimes what this is aiming towards is not to reach every Canadian, but to reach a small proportion who become very vocal and make policy implementation difficult. That's something we've seen in a report we did recently on local climate mis and disinformation, is that it wasn't necessarily that, say, 80% of people in a municipality believed something, but a small number did, and they made policy implementation very difficult. So it's sometimes not about the large number of people, it's about a small number who create different sets of difficulties. So just a few other ways that I think looking at this historically can reframe the problem.
Thank you
So
both.
I'm afraid I think our live stream ended prematurely there. I think that Jeremy may have had a technical issue. Jeremy, you're back on, eh?
I actually believe we're still streaming.
Okay. Well, I'm glad
Yeah,
to have interrupted the fabulous conversation.
yeah,
no worries at all. But it's actually we did stop the Zoom recording, but I will just say we do have about 14 minutes left before we have to stop the panel. So I believe we have time for two more questions from our
Please.
moderators. And I will very quickly pass it off to Anastasia.
I think it's Muskan. Is that orange? Yeah, okay.
My bad, Muskan. It's you. I'm so sorry about that.
No worries at all. Well, thank you both for sharing your remarks and how these specific threats pose towards our democracy and specifically a national security threat. Kind of shifting gears, and I know we touched upon it a bit briefly by Professor Tworek, but how can we safeguard our democratic institutions? What can we as citizens in Canada take on a day-to-day basis to combat disinformation that foreign bias, like Mr. Kolga, you mentioned, is posed onto Western democracies? I will begin with Mr. Kolga, and then I'll pass it over to Mr. Tworek.
Okay, well, that's a great question. There's no silver bullet. I don't think anyone's identified one yet. Maybe Dr. Tworek has seen one, but I certainly don't have a silver bullet for this. I think that we do have institutions set up within the Canadian government that have become quite effective, at least at identifying and exposing some of the narratives that are targeting Canadians. One of those is the Rapid Response Mechanism within Global Affairs Canada. This is a team that is dedicated to monitoring our information space for foreign information operations, and they regularly put out social media posts, reports and such, which are intended to raise awareness amongst key stakeholders within Canadian society, with media, elected officials, academic, civil society. And so the work that they're doing is actually intensifying, and I think it is becoming quite impactful, and it is having a positive impact in terms of the resilience of our democracy. They are, of course, working during the election with the SITE task force. This is the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections task force, which includes key members of our intelligence community and also global affairs. I mentioned earlier this Chinese campaign targeting former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. within I think it was a day or two of the RRM detecting that campaign, Site put out a statement exposing it. And so that clearly demonstrates, to me at least, that the system that's been set up to secure our information space, but certainly during a writ period, it is working. Site is having regular briefings. They had one just on Monday where they brought up a problem in social media whereby I think a financial services company or something like that was putting out fake ads targeting various different candidates in the election, trying to lure people into their website and to click on these ads. So they exposed that. So that system, at least, we know it is working. Certainly, it can be improved, but so we do have these institutions in place to protect our democracy. We could be looking to our allies who are doing this quite effectively. There's in Sweden, for example, they have created a psychological defense agency designed to do exactly the sort of things that RRM is doing, but expanding it a little bit more to actively advocate for and support the development of resilience within Sweden's democracy. So there's a large group. This agency has been set up to do that, and I think that we could look to a country like Finland. Finland has, of course, ensured that critical thinking, media literacy is built into their entire school curriculum. So students from kindergarten through high school are taught digital media literacy within every course that these children take. So if a child is taking a course on statistics, there might be an element within that course that teaches those students how statistics might be manipulated by whether it's a foreign actor or anyone else. Similarly, you would have an element of that in a history course. So almost every single course in the Finnish curriculum has an element of this, and that is proving to be quite effective in Finland. So looking at allies that are doing this to improve what we already have, to develop what we've already built. But this is, like I said, there's no silver bullet that can fix the current information environment, clear up the environment. This is a long-term process that we need to start engaging in.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Professor Tworek.
Yeah, just to add onto this, that of course it's really important what we do during an election. Elections are protected periods for a whole host of historical and understandable reasons, but we also see the rise of what many scholars call the permanent campaign in Canada, which means that a lot of things are happening around politics and campaigning beyond the writ period. So I think that just speaks to the need to be understanding and working with people to think about media literacy long before an election. There's obviously a lot of movement in this election, but there are a lot of people who are also already fixed in what they're going to vote. And that's a result of both their own lived experiences and potentially a lot of the information environment that they've already encountered, right? So they may be sort of entrenched within that long before an election. There's all sorts of other things that we can think about looking further afield than Sweden and Finland. We've seen Taiwan really, really change the amount of trust in government through much more radical transparency. Something that I think it's worth democratic governments considering, right? Not necessarily needing to FOIA so much, because so much of what the government does is already very, very radically transparent. And the former digital minister, Audrey Tang, now is a kind of digital ambassador talking about those kinds of techniques. So I think there's actually a whole host of countries that are innovating and thinking about what does it mean to be a democracy in the 21st century, and how do we think about democratic values related to information. Obviously, others relate to public media systems, to digital literacy that goes beyond thinking about children, because there's all sorts of things like fraud and scams that are primarily targeting the over 65s, for example. If we're thinking even about the kinds of financial fraud that we are seeing, unfortunately, on the rise, we can't just educate children about that, because people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are also subject to that. So what are the kinds of spaces and places we can use to reach people beyond that, I think are also really important debates that we need to have, because children are just one piece of this much bigger puzzle.
Can I just add something there?
Sure, yeah.
Where we also need to become more effective is in our own strategic communications, how we communicate with Canadians in promoting democratic values, to talk about democracy, and to talk about those sorts of issues that our foreign adversaries try to target. I think that's also a very key component. And Dr. Tworek brings up Taiwan. Taiwan does all of this very effectively. They've taken a whole of society approach. That means academia, media, civil society, frontline defenders of democracy and government are all working together to build that resilience. And this is something that Canada really needs to look closely at and simulate, I think, if we want to build that long-term resilience.
Okay,
Sorry.
I would suggest one more question, but we are very low on time, so I may propose this instead. Mr. Kolga and Dr. Tworek, if there is one thing you could say to Canadians today, to everyone worldwide, you're at the UN, you can provide just one bit of advice on how to handle disinformation, on how to be resilient against it, what would you say? I'll start with you, Mr. Kolga. I know that's a huge question. I know that might be a bit of a curveball, but
Well, I mean, it's a sort of a silver bullet question, right? One thing that I would say is try to limit your exposure to disinformation. You should also then limit the time you spend on social media. Get off social media. Number one, get yourself off of Twitter and X, and as many other social media platforms as possible. Now there are alternative ones. Blue Sky is one that is being used more and more, which is basically, in terms of functionality, it mirrors Twitter. But there was just a recent report that was put out by the European External Action Service and their Eastern Stratcom, I think it was their third FEMI report, which basically stated that Blue Sky is also now being infiltrated by foreign actors. So, social media, reduce your exposure to disinformation by pulling yourself off social media platforms. Subscribe to a newspaper. I think we can all trust journalists. I think mainstream media has been maligned, but they do employ journalists who are trained to handle facts. They are trained on how to report those facts. We can trust professional journalists. So get a subscription to a newspaper. Trust your television, your local television news report. Listen to the radio, local radio as well. Especially those that employ professional journalists. That is the best way of getting out of this, protecting our information space and making sure that you have access to good information.
Dr. Tworek.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one to complement that, think about what you're consuming the news for. And if it's confirming what you already believe, if it's evoking strong emotions, then maybe ask yourself why it might be doing that and what the reason is. Not consuming as much doesn't mean that you don't care, but it does mean that maybe you start doing stuff in the real world. So that's one, I think, really important question to ask oneself. If one is doom scrolling for 2 hours, what am I doing it for? And what might I be doing with that time instead that perhaps achieves the goals I think I'm achieving?
Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to hand it off to Anastasia to Anastasia and Mr. Baines for closing remarks.
Thank you, James, and thank you to the both of you for your answers. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone, for this insightful discussion. On behalf of the NATO Association of Canada, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our expert panelists, Mr. Marcus Kolga and Dr. Heidi Tworek, for sharing their invaluable perspectives on the critical issue of disinformation. I would also like to thank Muskan and James for moderating the discussion with me, and Robert for his opening remarks. Today's conversation has highlighted the urgency of addressing disinformation as it impacts democracy, society, and national security. We appreciate your perspectives and look forward to continued dialogue in these critical times. And yeah, once again, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, we are no longer live. Sorry about the